cappella group. It was recorded that started it out so you could actually hear all the parts. And then at some point, you began singing along with it, and then just a little bit into it, then the recorded stuff went off, and it was just you, and it really sounded amazing. I was really intrigued at the way that you could learn and maybe even hear the different parts a little bit better. Anyway, it was really encouraging. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. I know that there were a handful of people from here that went, including Jim Cope, and so I'm hoping that maybe we'll have an opportunity to get some additional training in singing new songs and that kind of thing. So let's get back on track though for our class. So, you know, I had a handout. There was a assignment. Did anybody, you know, reach out to somebody and invite them to be here tonight? Got to take that step. I really want to encourage us to do that. It can be scary, right? I know that I nailed a guy. I picked my guy Sunday morning as services were leaving, and at first I thought I had him, and then, you know, he started going, oh, I think I got something going on Wednesday night. But, you know, that's what it's going to take. We're going to have to reach out and invite somebody and encourage them to come here and be here, because really the thing that we're learning, or one of the things I'm trying to emphasize is that when we let worldly things run our schedule, we're letting those things be bigger than our God. And so we just gotta, we're gonna have to get courageous. Yeah, Mike. I did change my batteries. I put new batteries in tonight. Okay. All right. Thank you. So then the other thing that I asked you to do each week was to, you know, look at one or two of the verses that we had talked about, and, you know, see if there was something in particular, you know, meditate on it through the week, think about it. And the ones that I picked for myself were Proverbs 13:20, which was, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." And it's encouraging to know that if we surround our people with people that are using godly wisdom, then that's going to have a profound impact on us. It's going to be much better for us to be around people that are wise, that are using biblical wisdom to rule their life, than just worldly wisdom. All right. So we're going to get going here on our there we go. On our slide. So last week we just got to this slide. It was making my kids bigger than God. And so we're going to, because I really kind of rushed to get us into that, we're going to just back up here. And remember, what I'm doing is I'm calling on you to read these scriptures. This is not just me up here trying to teach you. This is us together in a Bible class. So Matthew 10:37 says, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." That's a pretty big statement. Because I think as parents, we have a tendency to really love our kids a lot. And we probably do things for them in a sense that puts them ahead of God in our priorities. And I'm speaking from experience. I'm not saying this is what you guys are doing. I'm saying these are the kinds of things that I did as a parent. And you know, when you look in the rearview mirror, sometimes you can go, wow, I wish I would have done things different. And maybe a lot of you are just as old as me, and you're thinking, well, this doesn't apply to me, but it does, because we still have grandkids, or maybe we'll have great-grandchildren, or maybe we have the ability to influence some of the younger kids in the congregation, even though they're not our kids. So this stuff is important. So what does it mean to love son or daughter more than me? Is not, you know, that is really, God is telling us, don't let these physical relationships with other people be more important to you than me? And so then I had on here academic excellence, artistic endeavors, and athletics. And I think these are three areas that parents have a tendency to put way too much focus on worldly things and not the right amount of focus on godly things or spiritual things. And so now in my family, we wanted our kids to get good grades. I think probably every parent does. We set a goal. Hey, let's get straight A's. But we didn't have lots of systems in place to help make that work. It was almost like it was just like a dream. Oh, it'd be so good if they would do that. And we weren't as good about making sure that homework was being done and those kinds of things. So as parents, if we're pursuing, if our kids getting into the Ivy League school or the right college or having their whole college experience paid for because they've got all these scholarships lined up because of all this hard work they've done, but they've neglected, or we've allowed them to neglect the spiritual part of their life, then I'm saying we've allowed that to be bigger than God. We didn't put the emphasis where it really should have been as parents. It should have been on learning God's word and making sure that we have them at the Bible class opportunities that are available through the local church. Making sure that we have Bible class or Bible study opportunities in our own homes and not just relying on what the church gives them. I would say that would be an area where I made a mistake. I felt like, I got my kids there on Sunday morning. I see your hand up, Jimmy. I'll get to you in a minute. I had my kids there on Sunday morning. I had my kids there on Wednesday night. They're getting all they need. And I neglected to make it more of a priority in my home. And I think that was a mistake. And so I want to encourage young people that have kids today, don't make the same kind of mistake I made. I think it is vital that there is some amount of time set aside in the week, which is busy. I know how busy life is. But some amount of time where the family gets together and spends time either reading scripture together or studying, learning, going over a story in the Bible. Those are easy, I think. The home group thing that we just started, the idea is you take a story in the Bible and you get really familiar with it so that you can talk about it like it's a story, and that's how is a good way to get kids engaged in learning about the Bible. Jimmy.
It's also important to after talk with kids with the main church. Having those conversations is really important. But now you're also aware of what they're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I get a volunteer to turn to Matthew 22, verses 37 and 38, and then somebody get to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, and somebody Proverbs 22, 6. Matthew 22, 37 and 38, that's going to be Mike. Matthew 22, 37 and 38.
Whoever loves father more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me.
Is that chapter 10 or is that chapter 22? Because it's easy for Larry to make mistakes up here. Well, you're in Matthew, so we'll give you a second to get there.
Okay. And he said to him, Who shall love the Lord your God with all their heart and with all their soul with all their mind. This is the great and first commandment.
All right, so I don't know if everybody could hear him. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. This is the foremost commandment. This is the biggest one. It doesn't say you should love your kids there. And I think as parents, we have a tendency to sometimes substitute in the hierarchy of things, and that manifests itself often in the way that we establish priorities. And we'll get to some, hopefully, I have some good ideas here about ways to help us with this. How about Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4? Mason.
I got it. All right. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
Thank you. I love that. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Well, the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you're, making sure that they're in the Word, that they understand. Well, first of all, you've got to understand it as the parent. And then you've got to be able to share that with your kids in an effective way. And sometimes it's easy to think, well, I don't want to provoke them to anger, so I'll just let them kind of do what they want. And that's not good practical biblical wisdom. That's like the coward's way out. We need to raise them up in the instruction of the Lord. How about Proverbs 22, verse 6?
I got that. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it.
I love that proverb. Now, as a proverb, is that like an absolute, this is going to happen 100% of the time? No. It's a general principle that says if you do this, the outcome can likely be this. And I think, I used to say this to over and over and over again as my kids would go, train up a child in the way I should go, and when he's old, he's just going to be a Christian. That's not what that says.
No guarantee.
There's no guarantee. But the wise person takes the first part of that and says, I'm gonna train them up in the way they should go. And if they don't wind up walking with the Lord, I don't want to look back and say, oh, I should have done this. I didn't spend enough time encouraging them. We didn't spend enough time doing lots of these Christian or religious or church-related activities. We were so focused on the other stuff. And then, your kids get to be adults and you're wondering, why aren't they walking with the Lord? Bruce.
The first part of that proverb is on the parents.
Yes.
The second part of the proverb is on the kid. As the kid, as a free moral agent,
right,
is old enough to make their own choices, and they choose wrong, that's on them.
Right.
You did your part.
You did your part. If you did your part, right. If you did your part, you did your part. Exactly. But if you were lax in it, and again, I can stand up here and say, I know I made a lot of mistakes. I learn a lot better from other people's mistakes. I think a person's much wiser when somebody comes to him and says, hey, if you play in the street, you're probably going to get hit by a car. I'm smart enough to know, okay, I'll just stay out of the street because I don't want to get hit by a car. And so I think it behooves us to take the experiences that other people have had and consider that. To me, that's going back to the idea of walking in wisdom. Did I see a hand, Rick?
Well, and if we as parents do what we're supposed to do with teaching our children, it becomes a foundation. It becomes a muscle memory. And if they do walk away from the church, that foundation will always be there. And someday, through the grace of God, they're going to remember what they should be doing. And, so it could still pay off.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying that if we don't get them, at 17 when they're walking out the door, it's a lost cause. But really, to ensure the greatest amount of success in this, we need to be starting on them when they're tiny. And we need to have, I can't remember what my 3 things are, but we'll get to them in a minute. Yeah, Steve.
So there was the guy who founded the Jesuit schools. So in the Catholics, he was a Jesuit. And he said, give me your child until he's 8 years old, and he will never stop being a Catholic. but he had found out, okay, if you raise up a child in this way, you can ingrain in them for the rest of their life a belief system.
Yeah.
And that's relatively true.
Yeah.
It takes wisdom, but there is a way
Yeah.
to have pretty broad success with that method. So.
I'm envisioning, I'm imagining if that took a lot of repetition and a lot of, it was an ongoing thing. You didn't just see those kids twice a month and get something like that ingrained in them. Jimmy?
That's where Deuteronomy 6 to 9 comes into play. You know, God's telling them, when you wake up in the morning, be talking about my words. When you're on your way to the field, when you're on your way home, when you sit for lunch.
Right.
And before you go to bed, the last thing they hear is my words. But also there was a Pew poll that was done, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago. They found that most children have already made up their mind by the time they're 12 or 13. Those that grew up in the church have already made up their mind by the time they're 12 or 13 if they're going to continue in the church after they leave the home. So, you know, like you said, we've got to be teaching our kids young, but you know, it can't be rules. It has to be about relationship that we're teaching.
Right. We need to make sure that it's their heart that we're influencing. Because that's the thing that God wants.
Right.
He wants their heart. We demonstrate where our heart is. I think Scripture tells us in lots of ways by the things we're doing. We're gonna, that's really gonna demonstrate where our heart is by the things that we're doing. So that was a great point you made. And I don't, we don't have a lot of young kids here tonight, but I mean, how likely are we to have a conversation on the way home after services about, what we talked about in services, or maybe do we sing a couple of our favorite hymns on the way home, or when we're on a road trip? What is everybody on their iPads now or on their phones? That's the picture that I get in my mind. Everybody's in the car. Everybody's got their own device. Everybody's doing their own thing, and nobody's talking anymore. Is that how it is? It seems like whenever I don't know at what age kids get phones these days, but it seems pretty young to me, and it's almost like it's easier to just have them go do something on their phone than it is to engage them in some other spiritual training. I have artistic endeavors on here, so it's not just the math, it's not just the good grades, but sometimes it's like, I want my kid to be and I think I mentioned that my dad was a piano player. I want my kid to be really good at theater or dance or some of these artistic endeavors, and that becomes bigger than God. Athletics is a big thing. I think sometimes we're naive enough to think, my kid's going to grow up and he's going to be in the NFL. Or my kid's going to play, Major League Soccer, or NBA, or MLB, and we stopped to think, really, these park and rec games that we get our kids into. That's really just to give them a fundamental thing. But when we start putting so much energy and effort into that activity, and it supplants or replaces the amount of effort that we're putting into the spiritual thing, then we've made our kids bigger than God. Okay, we're moving to the next slide. So these are the same three things that I had when we're making ourselves bigger: fear, pride, and ignorance. And so they're the same scriptures. 2 Timothy 1:7 said, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. So what are we afraid of? When we're letting our decision making be, the grades are the big thing, or the pursuing of the arts is the big thing, or the sports is the big thing, is it because I think they're not going to love me or they're not going to respect me? Is that what I'm afraid of? They're not going to succeed from a worldly perspective if I don't give them if I don't put this much effort into it? If that's the case, that's sinful fear. Believing something to be more powerful than God is sinful fear. And if I'm afraid that, little Heath isn't going to love me because, I didn't buy him a pony, or whatever the thing is. And I think sometimes that's what's in our minds. Pride. Proverbs 11 verse 2 was, when pride comes, then comes dishonor, but with the humble is wisdom. How many times do you think we're thinking, I got to keep up with the neighbor? I mean, their kid's in this, their kid's in that, their kid's in that, and my kids want it because they're friends. And so sometimes I think pride comes in there and like, well, we got to do that because otherwise we might be looked at on as bad parents or whatever's going through our minds. Oh, our kids deserve it. I mean, I said that. My kids deserve to be able to do that. And then, or it could just be, am I unwilling to obey God? And then ignorance, unaware of what God says about it. So that's one of the things that we're doing now. We're trying to eliminate the ignorance of it. We're looking at what the Word of... This isn't just what Larry says or what Larry thinks. We're going to Scriptures and seeing this is what it can look like if I'm allowing my kids to be bigger than God. Traditions would be another thing. My family's always done football, or my family's always played the piano, or, in my house, Becky was a flute player, and would you be surprised to learn that Tara had to play the flute? I mean, it seemed logical to me. But she doesn't play the flute anymore. So it wasn't and she didn't go on to become a concert flutist. Okay, now, how to make positive changes. I have 3 things on here. Establish priorities, set expectations, and establish limits. So the first thing we need to do is prepare for the temptation. Proverbs 22, verse 3. Who can get that for me? Raj? Roger, can you get that for me?
Sure.
Proverbs 22, 3.
23. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it.
Okay, the prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but my version says the naive, they go on and are punished for it. So we got to prepare for the temptation, and we're going to be tempted as parents to do some of this stuff, aren't we? Aren't we going to be tempted to want our kids to be in sports, or our kids to play the flute, or our kids to have a horse? Again, I think we're tempted. But we need to prepare for that and establish priorities in advance. And the proper priorities should be God first. And you can see I have in parentheses, church. I don't mean the church building. I mean being an active part of the local church, which is what God has called us to do if we're going to serve Him and be His people. Then our spouse, honestly, should be second, right after God. And then down there in the third level should be our kids. And sometimes we get those last 2 out of whack too. Sometimes we start spending so much emphasis and focus on our kids that we let our marriage relationships suffer. And that's not pleasing to God. That's allowing our kids to be bigger than God, because that's not the priority that God has given to us. And then set expectations. So I put performance, godly things, schools, and chores. So if you as a family say, we want to provide an opportunity for you to do whatever the thing is, play baseball. But there's expectations. You have to be doing well in Bible class. You have to be doing well at school. You have to be getting your chores done in an acceptable manner. And you get to set those expectations as the parents. And then attitude and behavior. If you have a good attitude, then the benefit is that you get to play baseball. And if you have a bad attitude, or you start falling off on these expectations, then there is a consequence. And sometimes it's harder for parents to actually hold kids accountable. And it was for us, because you almost want it as bad as they do. Or sometimes we want it more than they want it. Right? Yeah, Bruce?
Yeah, we make the mistake sometimes of living vicariously through our children.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're involved in junior tackle football, and our son or daughter,
Yeah.
is just really, really good at this particular position, you indirectly receive some glory for their performance on
Right.
the field.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that appeals to a person's ego or whatever. And
Right.
so it's a challenge then to forfeit a practice or a game that's going to conflict with being at worship. I mean, it
Right.
has to be a chore in and of itself.
And if we set those clear expectations on the front end, it's going to be much easier for us as parents trying to raise our kids in the way they should go, so that when they're old they won't depart from it, to make sure that we stick to whatever these expectations are that we've made and hold them accountable to them. I think in a sermon that I did, I was talking about baseball, and I was a kid's baseball coach, and I would tell kids, if you don't make the practice, you don't get to play. Or you're not going to get all the minutes you want, because there was a rule that said in Park and Rec, if they're on the team, they're going to play. Well, it's hard when you're a coach, and you want to win the game, but this kid cut practice, and they'd come around and tell me, I just went to the beach, coach. Okay, well, sorry, you're not going to pitch. I mean, you might get to, you're gonna play outfield or whatever, but we need to make sure that we're sticking to whatever the expectations are, and then establish limits. This endeavor gets allocated this much time in the life of our family, and it shouldn't be more time than we're willing to spend on the things that are going to reach into eternity than the things that are just going to be temporal. And then also, evaluate the expense. We did club soccer for one of our kids, and it was a huge expense. You had to travel to this town and that town, and luckily it wasn't like overnight. You could just get up really early and get there in time, but still driving expense and auto expense, and all of those things should be factored in there when we're supporting these things. Any comments or questions before we move to the next topic?
Larry?
Yep.
I think one more thing that we can add to that is, ask ourselves, how can we bring glory to God through these activities? Because we're at all times to be the example of Christ to the world, and God is going to bless anything we do in His name, and that. Not necessarily in His name, but in His will. If it's in God's will, He's going to bless that. And if our primary goal is to show Christ, then that needs to be something that we're asking ourselves. Whatever endeavor we're trying to do, how does this glorify God? And if it doesn't, maybe we ought not be doing it.
That's a great point, Jimmy. And so if we go back to like the sports analogy, we could just say, Part of this is making sure that you're a good sport in it, that you're not somebody who it's win at every cost. I'll step on the guy's neck if I have to. I mean, I know some of these sports that we allow our kids to get into are pretty physical, but still, you can still have a good sportsman attitude. When you knock a guy down, you help pick him back up. If you're trying to set a godly influence, as opposed to, we see things on TV, right? Don't we see really inappropriate behavior among professional athletes all the time? And you think, wow. And sometimes these individuals are really looked up to by lots of kids. So yeah, that was a good point. Okay, so now we're going to look at how to make my spouse bigger than God. And I got to tell you, I struggled with this one a bit. In my mind, the biggest struggle is when we choose a spouse that's not a Christian. Now, that doesn't mean it never happens in a home where both spouses are Christians. We already looked at Matthew 22:37. It said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest commandment. It isn't love your wife first, right? She's second after God. So the first points that we're going to make on here really, I think, probably lean more to the relationships where we're not married to a believing spouse. And so for younger kids like Mason's age, this would be and Trevor and Curtin and Alyssa and Journey. Hi, Journey. And Avery. I mean, you can avoid a lot of the things that I'm going to mention here by making a good godly choice when you're picking out your spouse. Now, I don't have a lot of experience in this because I was not a Christian when I got married, neither was my wife. We tried to influence our kids to pick Christian spouses. So, how do I make does that even make sense to you? Does anybody ever think this could be a problem? Do you know anybody, or do you look, I think we have some members of the congregation here that have unbelieving spouses, and you can see that it impacts their ability to serve. So that's kind of the point that I'm making. When it impacts our ability to serve God, depending on the choices that we're making our spouse bigger than God. Decisions that are based on fear. So if I put God first, He's not going to love me. And so,
Who's the he? The husband?
well, it would be a he. If it's a he, it's be the husband. So I'm going to alternate between women and men. I'm not going to throw the men under the bus all the time. So if I'm a godly woman and I have an unbelieving spouse, and the fear that is real for them often is, if I put God first, my husband's not going to love me. And so how does that manifest itself? I forsake the assembly. If I put God first, she's not going to respect me. And is that a legitimate thing that goes through our minds? Is that a fear that would impact our decision making? I think it is. So, because of the pressure that can be in a marriage where there's unbelieving and believing spouses, I'm going to just skip Bible class. I'll go for worship because she knows that's really important to me. But I can't be there. I can't be there all the time, and so I'm making choices based on fear. If I put God first, He might leave me. So I'm just not going to be able to make time to associate with other Christians. So Romans chapter 12, verse 10. It says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. And so you got to be around people in order to be able to do that. And if the relationship that you've gotten into by having an unbelieving spouse, and the pressure that can come from that, and the fear is he's going to lead me if I'm all in, and I guess that would be if I'm all in with the church, or if I'm all in spiritually, I want to be active in my local church, and I think that's oftentimes why we see men and women that have unbelieving spouses that aren't able to or don't choose to do all that I think that they know that they should be trying to do. If I put God first, she won't meet my needs. In this case, I'm talking about the sexual needs. So I just won't give financially to the Lord. And I think that is a reality that happens as well. If I put God first, He might cheat on me. So if I'm making if I'm saying I'm going to love the Lord my God with all my heart, He's going to be where my first allegiance is. And I want to do all these things. Well, He might cheat on me, so I'm not going to put any pressure on Him. I'm not going to, and that's not that I wouldn't. It's not that we wouldn't, try to be a good example. But I'm not going to put the pressure on. I'm not going to say, honey, you really should be going to church. Honey, you really should be going to church. You really should be going to church. That kind of pressure. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16 says, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So when we have an unbelieving spouse situation, there's just so much more pressure on us. And so wisdom says pick a believing spouse.
Well, the scripture also says, speaking about a woman who's a widow, but he says you're free to remarry, but only in the Lord. But I don't think that's exclusively for widows. I think that's a command for Christians, that if you're going to marry only in the Lord. There's a place where you're converted after you're married, but for Christians, I don't think there's an exception to be marrying non-Christians and being faithful as a faithful choice in spouse.
I totally agree with you, but what do we see happening all the time? I know with at least one of my kids, the wife that he picked wasn't a believer, and so I said, well, you gotta have a conversion class and be baptized, or I won't marry you. So they did that, but in a sense, that was really kind of going through the motions. And so it's easy to find yourself in that situation. Oh, all I have to do is check a box? No. Did I see it? Who did I have a hand up? Mike. And then Bruce.
I think we need to take a step back, because you're dealing with this situation because of the previous situation, which I've never, and a lot of Christians I know have not addressed, and that is, who are your kids hanging out with in the first place? You go back to the sports and all these other...
How far back are you taking us?
Where your children start building relationships, because that's who they're going to marry. It's in that pool of people, and if we can't convince our children to make that inner pool of people Christian people, then the rest of it, we've already lost the battle, because now you're playing catch up of having all these outside relationships of these people that they're going to be interacting with, and to me, it's an impossible fight from that standpoint. Yeah, God will bless you every once in a while. Somebody will be converted, but that's not the rule by a long shot.
Yeah.
Too many people drug out of the church because they were already involved with non-Christian people.
Did you have something, Bruce?
I would just kind of suggest that the Lord's solution to where we are back on the lesson is the unbelieving husband may be won without a word from his believing wife, as he observes her chaste and respectful behavior.
Right.
That speaks to not just what's going on with her in the church and so on, but it's their life together.
Correct.
And so if she's the child of God that she's supposed to be, that God expects her to be, then the likelihood is there's a far better chance that he'll be converted by that example rather than her browbeating him every chance she gets to come to church.
Right.
So she's got to, and I'm not saying that's easy. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in that scenario, frankly. Right. Because it's a very, very tough place to be, I think.
Are you hearing that, Mason and Avery? Don't get in that situation. Rick.
I can actually speak on that situation, because when Jamie and I got together, she was a Christian and I was not. But just like your previous slide where you set the expectations, Jamie's faith was so strong, she sat me down and said, look, God is first. if we want to be together, this might be something you'd be interested in. And, it ended up with me being converted as well. Because of her conviction for her faith, it brought me to God. And, so it, just like the passage Bruce just read, it's possible. Granted, it's not the optimal choice, but, there are cases out there.
Yes. And I wasn't trying to indicate that it's an uphill battle. It's not impossible. And then I think sometimes also we can have a tendency, in order to protect relationship or our reputations, not getting the help that we need. So if you have conflict in your marriage, and it's part of the result of that conflict is you're making your spouse bigger than God. We have a tendency, I think, to hide our difficulties and not really seek to get help. And I think that's another thing that's really harmful to the marriage itself, and that's a pride issue. And pride is really a big deal for our species. We have a tendency to be very prideful at times. Now, some of these same principles I think can apply in where we have two Christians that are married together. We're not always at the exact same place in our service and in our faithfulness to God, are we? Sometimes the wife is really strong and the husband is weak. Sometimes the husband is really strong and the wife is struggling. And when those situations arise, sometimes we can, by the choices that we can make our spouses bigger than God, even when both of us are Christians. And so that to me would just be an example of that would be like, if I'm really struggling and I decide, church isn't important to me right now, I'm just going to do this other thing. I'm not going to go to. I'm not interested in going to services on Sunday right now. And then through my influence, my bad influence, I get my wife to do the same thing. Then I have now. My spouse has allowed whatever it is that they're trying to do with me to be bigger than God. Okay, I told you this. The spouse thing was a struggle for me, but I wanted to put it in there because I know at times it is a problem. So now we're going to how to make a positive change. The new way, the old way. Planning. Well, we've already kind of talked about this, but put God first in our marriages start out by choosing a Christian spouse. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Avery, could you do 2 Corinthians 6:14 for us?
Not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness?
Okay, what does that mean to you, Avery? What does that say? What is God saying to you in that verse?
You can't go both ways. You have to choose one or the other.
Okay, good. In case you couldn't hear what she said, 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light and darkness? This does not only apply to the marriage relationship. This principle applies to every relationship. Don't let your best friends be unrighteous people, because that puts a strain on your ability to serve the Lord. How about Proverbs 21, verse 19? Kurt.
It is better to live in a desert land than with a contagious and irritating woman.
Oh, man. I don't know if you could hear that. It's better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and vexing woman. Do you think the same principle applies to a guy? Oh, absolutely, it does.
Absolutely not.
I mean, it is better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and vexing husband. I mean, the principle would be the same. It's not, I don't think God really is just saying women are the only people that can be contentious. How about Proverbs 31, verse 30? Alyssa?
Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised.
Okay. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. You think that you could say the same thing about a guy? Charm is deceitful and handsomeness is vain, but a man who fears the Lord, he should be praised.
Sure.
I think I don't think that it's specifically saying it's excluding the other sex. And so when we're getting ready to pick somebody out to spend the rest of this life with, let's take these principles that are from God's wisdom and put them to use. Let's not get unequally yoked with a non-Christian spouse, and let's look for husbands and wives that are going to be servants of the Lord and going to be add blessings to us in our walk with the Lord. So that was planning. How about preparation? Create habits and routines. So read and study to pray together. How many couples do that regularly? Read and study together. Now, I would say don't raise your hands because sometimes we don't want to embarrass ourselves. But this is something I think most couples could work on. Set aside one block of time in your week and say, for this 15 minutes or this 30 minutes, we're gonna focus on spiritual things together. Read, study, pray together. Dedicate time for worship and service. So, everybody that's here tonight, you've already dedicated some time for worship and service. You're serving one another by being here. You're encouraging one another. You're growing in your knowledge and wisdom of the Lord. Those are things that couples need to do. And then execute. Plan, prepare, and execute. Fulfill the commitments that you've made to the Lord and to each other. And that's always going to be easier if the two of you are both Christians and you're working together to build your faith and to grow in your knowledge and your ability to serve the local church. Okay, friends. Here's another big area where I think we have a tendency to make our friends bigger than God. Now, most of the rest of this is probably going to apply to lots of younger people. Certainly people Mason's age and Avery's age and Alyssa's age and Curtin and Trevor and Troy and Brian and Callie. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Do not be deceived, bad company corrupts good morals." That is a principle of truth in God's Word. What does that mean? Bad company corrupts good morals.
You become part of who you're hanging around with.
Okay. So if you're hanging out with the wrong crowd and getting the wrong kind of influence, it's going to have an effect on you. And I think sometimes what we like to think is, well, I'm going to be the good influencer, and so I'm going to go hang around with those guys, and my goodness is going to win the day.
I'll get them to come to church with me.
Well, that's what's going through our mind, and that's not a bad thing.
No.
And certainly we know we can't just completely be out of the world. But the truth of this statement is that most of the time the immoral is going to win the battle. So we got to be careful. Jimmy?
From the earlier slide, you said that we need to put limits on things, and this is one of those. We do have to be out in the world around ungodly people, but we should be putting time limits on
Yeah, and we gotta be careful. Monitor. You gotta, parents have to be active in what their kids are doing. The term latchkey kids anymore, where both parents are working, kids come home from school in lots of families, and they're unsupervised, and parents don't know what's going on, and oftentimes it's until it's too late. So, drugs. Drugs is a big problem in our country. And, I know when I was a kid, it started out with marijuana. That was the easiest available drug to get a hold of. And there was pressure, peer pressure from people that were already doing it to get you to do it too. And you have to be strong in order to be able to say no. But marijuana always leads to something else. And I put methamphetamine on here because methamphetamine is a big deal today. In my career in the fire service in the 90s and in the early 2000s, my small little fire department in North Idaho, we were going on 2 or 3 meth labs a week. There was a meth lab epidemic in Kootenai County, and it lasted for about 2 years. And there was so much pressure put on it by ISP that the meth people moved to other areas because it was costing them too much. Now, if we would have only been, if the effort that was being put out would have been 1 a month or a couple every 6 months, the meth people just stick around because when it's easy pickings, that's where they go. And those things lead to addiction. And what I'm telling you is, because I know from personal experience, the people that you hang out with have a big impact on these choices that you're gonna make. Alyssa and Avery and Mason and Curtin and Trevor and Bryant and Troy and Callie. Alcohol is another thing. Maybe it starts out with beer. That's what it was when I was a kid. Oh, you're just gonna, get a beer. It's no big deal. And then, or wine, because I think people are more refined in these days. It was just beer back then. Now it's wine, and that always leads to other things like hard liquor and then alcoholism. And again, most of that comes from the influence of others. Sexual sin typically starts in our teen years, typically through a bad example of someone else. There's a whole bunch of everything seems to be tolerable these days. There's all kinds of sexual sin that we're being told we just have to accept. And most of that is going to come through bad examples. Pornography would be another one. Doesn't have to be physical contact, sexual sin. There's so many other options out there, and it's going to be those friends that are saying, "Oh, this is okay. It's no big deal. Everybody's doing it." Theft, stealing. As a kid, I had a little theft problem. Now I don't, and I didn't get it. I didn't dream it up on myself. I had a friend who said it was okay. We rode our bicycles for a very long ways back then. Like, where the Baskin and Robbins is in town now, from clear out where the ice skating rink is. I mean, it was like desolate land. And went in, and I stole the Matchbox car because my buddy said, "Hey, you won't get caught. It's no big deal. It's only $1. Nobody cares." Well, when my grandma found out, she cared, and it was hard because I had to go back with my grandma to the store, return the item, beg for mercy. But it was a friend that I chose that helped lead me down that path. Now there had to be something in me that said it was okay too. I'm not saying it was just my friend, but that choice is one of the things that helped me get there. And so when we start out stealing from our siblings or our parents. I stole some cigarettes from my parents and got caught. But eventually that kind of behavior leads to the penitentiary. And that's not a place where you guys want to spend much time. Cheating. I read an interesting little article on this that actually cheating is a learned behavior typically between the age of 5 and 8. And I thought, that seems weird. Why would that be? And this article said that we put so much emphasis on winning. That we make such a big, oh, you won the game, what a great thing. And then, of course, the person who didn't win, they begin to think, well, winning is a big deal. And so then cheating can become a way to get the accolades. And so we have to be careful about placing so much emphasis on winning and maybe be a little bit more diligent about placing emphasis on, wasn't it fun to play the game together as a family? It doesn't matter that Mason won. The great thing was we got to spend time together as a family and we enjoyed it. Lying or deceiving, again, I think that starts, I don't know how it starts, but I know that we can be influenced by the people that we're hanging out with to do it. And maybe it starts with our parents or the civil authorities or ourself, but it never produces good things for us in life. Bad language start usually at home. Now we're seeing it on TV and social media, and then our acquaintances. So we want to avoid these kinds of things. We know these things are none of this stuff is acceptable to God, and so let's make sure when we're choosing our friends that we're making good choices, and we won't make our friends bigger than God by doing this. So we're out of time. We'll get into the changes next time. So we'll have a prayer and then we will be dismissed. I think maybe one more week, Steve, is all I need. All right, let's close with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the time that we've had this evening to consider these things from your word and these choices that we make in this life. Help us, God, to never make anything bigger than you, but to recognize that our love belongs to you first, and help us to have priorities that are in alignment with your will and your word. Help us to be faithful in our service to you, and help us, God, to be a blessing to those around us. We ask you to be with those that are not here this evening. We pray you continue to be with us through this week, that you would watch over us and keep us in your care. We love you so much. We're thankful, God, that you've chosen to love us. In Jesus' name, amen.